I think there's something shifting in the intellectual world. Around 2006, 2007, we had the first spate of these books that were titled under the genre of the new atheism. Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, the sort of in-your-face atheism that was expressing not only the idea that science, properly understood, undermines belief in God, but gee, that's also a good thing. We got to get rid of this God idea from the culture. I think fast forward about 15 years, and here we are. We have a lot of what I did a piece in the Jerusalem Post last summer about the passing of Steven Weinberg, who was one of those aggressive scientific atheists. He was famous for saying, the more the universe seems comprehensible, meaning to our science, the more it seems pointless. That kind of point of view, I think, is on the wane, and there are a lot of people who are intellectuals who are still non-believers, but who are lamenting the loss of a religious mooring for our culture. I think about people like Jordan Peterson, who's so interesting to listen to as he wrestles with these questions so authentically, or Tom Holland, the British historian,
he wrote the book Dominion.
Dominion, yeah, very interesting book.
I mean, I'm probably speaking for most people here that if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson or Tom Holland, you kind of find it hard to believe that they're not Christians. How could they not be, knowing what they know?
Yeah, you get the sense they're teetering, but there's a whole class of intellectuals who I think would like to believe but can't quite get themselves over the line. And yet, I think unbelief in our culture arose as a pervasive phenomenon in the late 19th century with the rise of figures like Darwin and Marx and Freud. And I think those intellectual influences are something of a spent force now. That's the argument of the book, is that the new discoveries of science about the universe having a beginning, or about the fine-tuning that makes life possible, or about the discovery of digital code and a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system inside the cell, these sort of things were not expected from the point of view of good old-fashioned 19th century scientific materialism, or expected by people like Dawkins, who framed the issues very helpfully. Dawkins said, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And in the book, I take him at his word and say, is that really the case? Did materialism, did blind, pitiless forces expect a beginning to the universe, or the exquisite fine-tuning that makes life possible, or the exquisite complexity of the cell? I don't think so. I don't think it did.
Well, I mean, when you're talking about these different figures, as you know, because we've talked about this, but when I finally dared to read some of what Dawkins or Hitchens wrote, I was mystified at the level of what I saw as nothing less than intellectual dishonesty, incredible sloppiness. I really was astonished. I expected better, in a way. And I thought that they must know that they're playing a game. They're people that I can take seriously who are wrestling, and I honor them as they wrestle. But the so-called new atheists seemed to me to be dramatically out of their depth when it came to philosophizing about these things. And what amazes me, in a way, is that they got away with it. It's like they were looking for undergraduate applause, like that was the bar that they were setting. And they really didn't care if smart people could see that there's nothing to this.
I've always really appreciated several of the new atheists, Dawkins in particular, for his talent for framing issues. In fact, the quote I just used is a beautiful framing device, because it allows you to answer a really fundamental question if the question is posed right. He says, basically the question is, does the universe look as it should if it's the product of blind, undirected, pitiless processes,
right,
or also known as scientific materialism, the worldview thereof? Or does it look as you'd expect if there was a purposeful intelligence behind it all? And I think that framing is incredibly productive for the conversation. I just think he's completely wrong.
Okay, let's start with why. In the book, the three main issues that you bring up in the Return of the God hypothesis, if I remember correctly, because it's been a while, it's the Big Bang.
The Big Bang, or the Big Bang is the theory that synthesizes evidence from observational astronomy and developments in theoretical physics. And the two together point to sometimes called the singularity, or a beginning to the universe. Okay. And that was incredibly surprising discovery of 20th century science.
Right. Okay. So let's start with that. How can someone like Richard Dawkins make the statement that he made, which you just quoted, given what we now know, that in the first millionth of a second after the Big Bang, and it's always funny when you're talking about the first millionth of a second after the Big Bang, like there's not enough time for after, is there? But that within no time, almost, we know the four fundamental forces in physics were established forever. How can somebody like a Dawkins, who is a scientist, imagine that happened without a designer? What could get him to say a thing?
That's where I agree with you. That's where I think the bluff comes in. Okay, the issue's framed beautifully, but the key evidence that helps adjudicate the question is not really taken head on. Dawkins doesn't really address this question of cosmic beginnings, but it's a crucially challenging piece of data for his point of view. Carl Sagan, in his famous Cosmos series, was quoted as saying, "The universe is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be." The materialistic or naturalist credo is the idea that matter and energy are the eternal self-existent things, and that they play the role of what philosophers sometimes call the prime reality, the thing from which everything else comes, in the same way that God plays that role in a theistic worldview or theistic framework. But the evidence of cosmology, the evidence of astronomy and astrophysics, is not pointing to a material universe that has been here from eternity past, but rather a universe that had a definite beginning. And as Robert Dicke, the famous Princeton physicist, said, an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. But a finite the sequel to that is, but a finite universe does not relieve us of that necessity. And the problem for materialists is that if the physical world of matter, space, time, and energy have a beginning, then before that or prior to that causally, there was no matter to do the causing. And that's the problem.
And this is where it becomes funny.
Faced.
So when somebody says there's matter and that's all there is and all there ever has been, you think, where are you getting that from? That is a decidedly unscientific statement made by somebody speaking in the name of science. So it just feels to me like there's been like tons of bluster and that they've painted themselves into an uncomfortable corner, because if you follow the science has increasingly been pointing to God. And now, I don't know how you see it as anything but open and shut. I mean, in your book, you talk about that. You talk about, I'm trying to remember, you talk about abiogenesis in the middle?
Yep, absolutely.
And then the DNA coding, right? Yeah. What do folks on that side say? I mean, let's talk a little bit about abiogenesis. I mean, tell us what that is, because I imagine there's some people here who aren't familiar with that. But that, to me, is just outrageously compelling.
Yeah, there are three big discoveries that I address in the book. The origin of the universe itself, the origin of its finely tuned structure. You're talking about those four laws of physics that were set from the very beginning. And those parameters were set against all odds within very narrow tolerances to make life possible. And that's the fine-tuning problem. We can come back to that. Yeah. And then the third is this question of getting life from non-life, or abiogenesis. And this was the field of my PhD dissertation. I did it on origin of life biology. And it was clear by the late 80s, when I was working, that the field had come to a place of complete impasse. In fact, one of my Cambridge supervisors said, everybody, she said, when we go to these origin of life society meetings, she said, our field is becoming dominated by quacks. She said, because everybody in the field knows that everybody else's idea won't work, but they won't admit it about their own. And so it's the big question is, how do you get from brute chemistry in a prebiotic soup or a favorable ocean environment or a hydrothermal vent or whatever to a living cell with all the intricacies that we now observe, including the digital code that's stored in the DNA that directs the construction of the proteins and the protein machines that are needed to keep cells alive. The more we've learned about the complexity of life, the harder it is to explain by reference to simple chemistry. And that gap between code, or between chemistry and code in our experience is only bridged by one and only one type of cause, and that's programmers, intelligent agents. So the discovery, I think, of digital code at the foundation of life is a powerful indicator of the activity of designing intelligence in the history of life, in the origin of life. And that's, I in the book, argue that as an inference to the best explanation, but I was having a conversation with a colleague today saying, on that topic, we stand in no risk of contradiction because there is no better explanation being offered by those who are formulating chemical evolutionary theories of abiogenesis. The field is in a complete disarray.
Well, just to break it down again, because I don't know what people here know or don't know, but I mean, I dealt with this in my book, so I can at least understand this. It's not like I say I know nothing and explain it to me, but break it down for folks here. Talk about Miller-Urey and what people were thinking, let's say 70 years ago. If we go back 70 years and somebody says, I believe in science, and I think science can tell us how the universe, through random processes, produced life. So where were we in 1952, and how complex did we think the simplest life was? I mean, if we go back, just to give them the benefit of the doubt of why they believed that this could just happen randomly.
Yeah, there's a huge historical irony here, because in 1953, Watson and Crick elucidate the double helical structure of the DNA molecule. In the same year, Miller-Urey are able to synthesize a couple of the protein-forming amino acids. And the one discovery, the two things, at the time people think, oh, science is making this great progress, even on these deep and fundamental questions about the origin of life. But what Watson and Crick discovered, and what was discovered subsequent to their first discovery, made theories of the chemical evolutionary origin of life increasingly implausible in the extreme. What Miller and Urey were able to do was build what are called two little building blocks of proteins. Proteins are the large molecules in cells that form intricate three-dimensional shapes, and in virtue of those three-dimensional shapes, they're able to perform all kinds of interesting jobs, all the most important jobs in the cell. You can kind of think of proteins like the tools in your toolbox. There's a hammer, a wrench, a saw, and each one has a different function based on its form. And the proteins catalyze reactions in the cell at rates much faster than would ever occur. They're called the enzyme proteins. They're also proteins that will build the parts of miniature machines. So we have those little rotary engines that you may have seen about that Michael Behe has made famous, or little turbines, or little walking robotic motor proteins. There's all kinds of intricate nanotechnology in the cell, and that's all made of proteins.
Although they didn't know about that in 1952.
They didn't know about any of this
when
in
Miller-Urey did their famous experiment,
right,
and they said, whoa, we got amino acids, we're on our way. They didn't know a lot of the stuff that you were just talking about. So it was very easy for them to say, well, we'll figure out how to get to life. We're not that far.
Absolutely. And one of the things one of my dissertation supervisors told me was that the more we know about the nature of life, the harder it becomes to explain its origin. And so if we learn more and more about the complexity of life and the inner workings of the cell. So first, Watson and Crick elucidate the DNA. That's pretty interesting. But then in 1957, Crick has this amazing brainstorm. It's called the sequence hypothesis. And he proposes that the chemicals along the interior of the helix, so you got this helical molecule, and the outside is made of what's called a sugar phosphate backbone.
We all knew that. Tell us something we don't know, Steve. Come on. Sugar phosphate backbone,
And on the inside, the business end, there are little bases called nucleotide bases that are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or digital characters like the zeros and ones in a section of machine code. So what Crick realizes is that DNA is performing a function in virtue of its information-carrying capability. That there's literally chemicals that are functioning like digital characters, conveying information for building those proteins I was talking about a minute ago. The big toolboxes that do all the job in the cell. So an analogy that's pretty apt would be like the technology that we know about for manufacturing, computer CAD/CAM, computer-assisted design and manufacturing. Up in Seattle, where we live, the Boeing plant, you'll have an engineer sitting at a console, write some code, goes down a wire. It's translated into a machine code that can be read at a manufacturing center that might be used to put rivets on an airplane wing. You have something very like that going on inside the cell, where you've got digital information directing the construction of these proteins.
But you're telling me that Crick figured this out in 57?
He figures this out.
See, this is, I'm surprised by that, because I just think that's, I can understand if we figured that out more recently. But the idea that a few years after the Miller-Urey experiment, they see this, what do they do? At that point, what did they do? What do you do with that kind of information?
For him, it was a hypothesis. Interesting thing about Crick's background is absolutely fascinating. He wasn't a biologist. He was doing a PhD in physics when he teamed up with Watson in 52, 53, and he had been a code breaker in World War II. So he had a deep intuitive understanding of what it took to transmit and store and even encode information. And so he realized fairly early on that DNA had all the features that were necessary for it to function as an encryption system, a way of storing and transmitting information. And so this was a hypothesis in 57. Then there was a flurry of activity in French labs, in labs in the UK, on the US side, and now historians of science call this period the molecular biological revolution. And by about 1965, they had sorted out that Crick was in fact right. That's what he thought DNA was doing was what it was doing. It was directing the construction of these fascinating large protein molecules that do all the important jobs in the cell. And then by that time, you already start to get real tension in the field of origin of life biology. What seemed an easy problem to solve in 1953, well, we got the amino acids. What could be simpler? Well, you have to get all the amino acids. There's not just 2 or 3 of them. There's 20 protein-forming amino acids. But you also got to get them to link up in the right way, and then you have to get them sequenced in the right way as well, so they fold into the right 3-dimensional shapes so that they can do jobs. And that's all got to be embedded in a larger information storage and processing system to actually produce what we now know as the simple cell.
Okay, so why, when you understand how outrageously complex it is, and it sounds like that happened way before I thought it did. I mean, it's happening in the 50s and then in the mid-60s. They know this. How could they possibly have continued thinking that random processes delivered this complexity? How do you tell yourself that when it's in front of you?
I think this is where the story of, this is where worldview intersects. I think coming out of the 19th century, many leading scientists in all fields were default scientific materialists. They believed that matter and energy were the things from which everything else came. This is why Einstein was so initially resistant to the Big Bang theory, by the way, is that his own theory of general relativity was implying that gravity couldn't be the only force in the universe. According to Einstein, gravity curves space. And if the only force in the universe is gravity, drawing all the other matter together, you get one big lump of space and one infinitely tight curvature of space around it. And there would be no room to put anything. We'd live in a giant black hole. But we don't live in a universe like that, so Einstein posited there must be an expansion force that's operating in opposition, an anti-gravity, what he called his cosmological constant. But that implied a dynamic universe moving outward from a beginning, which to him smacked to the doctrine of creation. And so he fiddled with his equations to try to
Actually, this is a good thing. This is something I actually do talk about wherever I go because I find it so funny. What we're really talking about here is worldview, right? We're talking about the idea that there's all this evidence, but people on either side have decided things that are immovable. And so the materialists they just know that there's no God, and we can't talk about that. We can't even think about that. So we'll just skip that, and we'll just figure out what we need to figure out. But we know it's not that. And what I find funny is that the greatest scientist, since Newton, was himself so insecure as a scientist. I mean, it's almost funny to me that you'd think that anybody could be guilty of worrying about what others think, but not Einstein.
Well,
Einstein was so scared of being tagged as a religious guy because of his equations point to the idea that the universe expanded from nothing. Sounds too much like Genesis. So he nervously, creates this fudge factor.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was in Einstein's case a case of social anxiety. I think it was just the power of a default way of thinking. This was the way all thinking people thought about things coming out of the 19th century. And so it was more of a reflexive, this can't possibly be the answer. It's got to be something that doesn't involve a beginning. But the part of the interesting story that I tell in the book is the story of these reversals. Einstein, by 1931, goes and views the evidence for himself at the Mount Wilson Observatory with Hubble. He's already been told about it in advance, so he's prepared. And he gives an interview to the New York Times 2 weeks later and says, well, I guess I got this wrong. The universe isn't static, it is expanding. And he later said that the way he fiddled with his own equations to try to obscure that fact was the greatest blunder of my life.
Hoyle, did he say it in English? The reason I'm asking is because I've seen it translated, or I've seen it phrased as it was the greatest stupidity of my life, and others said it's the greatest blunder of my life. And I wonder if he said it in German or in English. I don't know.
It's a good question, Eric. I don't know.
He may have simply said "whoopsie daisy."
Blunder, yeah.
Right? We don't know. But it is funny though that it took him 15 to 20 years to come to this reckoning and to deal with.
And then you have a very similar story with Fred Hoyle, who's a committed scientific materialist. He formulates the steady-state cosmology, which is a variant on Einstein's idea of the static universe, defends it tenaciously, but he's very explicit in explaining that he formulated this because the alternative was an overtly theistic view, and he was a scientific naturalist as a matter of his philosophy. And then later he discovers some of the most compelling and interesting and improbable fine-tuning parameters, the ones that are necessary to account for the abundance of carbon in the universe, which is necessary for life. And he later changes his view to a kind of quasi-theistic position and says the best data we have concerning the fine-tuning are what we'd expect if there was a super intellect that monkeyed with physics and chemistry. So he comes around. I actually had a conversation with him when I was still a grad student in Cambridge, and he'd come to talk about the origin of life problem. And afterwards, I chatted with him a bit and told him that I was working on this idea that DNA seemed to point to design, and he said, come walk with me. And we had this little walk down to the college common room, and he said, yeah, if we could invoke intelligence, it would make explaining a lot of things a lot easier.
When you said that, he said, come walk with me, I thought, you'd end up dead or something like that, because he's like, we can't have people like you around here. Yeah. The story of Hoyle, maybe you can shed light on this. I don't know if you write about it in the book. I don't remember, but I found it fascinating that Hoyle was he was dedicated to the idea that the right way of thinking is that there is no God and the universe has been here forever. And he clung to that long past when others, accepted the Big Bang. And we should say he coined the term Big Bang. He was speaking in a BBC interview in 1949 and speaking derisively.
He meant it as a pejorative.
Yeah, that stupid Big Bang thing. And it's like, whoop, the term kind of
caught on.
Yeah. And but as I read a little bit, I got the impression that he was maybe becoming more honest as the years passed.
Oh, no question. I mean, he was pretty much an advocate of the design hypothesis as it applied to the fine-tuning problem, and he was one of the scientists who formulated or who made those discoveries. So early on, he was said that religion is but a desperate attempt to give people comfort, and no wonder people get upset with people like me who tell them it's all an illusion. But later in his life, he says the best data we have are what we'd expect if a super intellect monkeyed with physics and chemistry. It was fine-tuning, suggested to him a fine-tuner.
If you don't mind my asking you, because I wrote about it in my book, and it's your story. You told me the story of the conference you were at in 1985 and what happened, because I want folks to hear a little bit of your story, how you got involved in everything that you've been doing in the last decades. Can you tell a bit about the story with Hubble and your conference?
Yeah, absolutely. I was young scientist. I was working as a geophysicist for a local oil company in Dallas. I had always been interested in the big questions, as you were saying before, that were at the intersection between science and philosophy. So as an undergrad, I did a double major in physics and geology, largely at my father's urging to stick with the hard sciences, but I always snuck over and took at least one philosophy class. Anyway, this conference came to Dallas, and it was called Christianity Challenges the University, an international conference of atheists and theists. It sounded pretty intriguing. They had 3 panels, one on the origin of the universe, one on the origin of life, and one on the origin and nature of human consciousness. And the panels were stocked with people who were either self-identified theists in their worldview or self-identified scientific naturalists or materialists. And in the very first panel, one of the most prominent speakers at the conference, Alan Sandage, a great cosmologist and astrophysicist.
And I meant Sandage, not Hubble.
Well, he had worked for Hubble. He was Hubble's
no, I know. That's why
student.
I made a mistake, but yeah.
So anyway, he went on to extend Hubble's research program, and he'd been a long time well known as an agnostic Jewish scientist. And at the conference, he announced a religious conversion, that he'd actually become a Christian.
In 1985, he announces this at the conference.
And explains and then proceeded to give a talk on the evidence of the new cosmology, what we'd learned from multiple sources, the light coming from the distant galaxies, the cosmic background radiation, all the different key evidences for the Big Bang, or the idea that the universe had a beginning. And then I remember him, he was not, in a way, he was not very happy about having this need to change his worldview thrust upon him. But that's where so he was a sort of very grave sort of figure. And he said, here is evidence for what can only be described as a super space natural event. There's no way this, meaning the evidence we have of the beginning of the universe, could have been explained or predicted within the realm of physics as we know it. And of course, that's the same point I was making before. You can't explain the origin of the physical world physically, because before there was a physical world, there was no physics to do the explaining. And so he then proceeded to explain that he was really moved to a point of thinking deeply about religious faith, because whereas the evidence was pointing unequivocally in one direction, he didn't want it to be so. And then he explained that he began to think about, well, what is it about me that doesn't want this to be so? I've always prided myself on my objectivity. It was a very compelling story. In the very next panel, there was a similar intellectual conversion announced by a leading origin of life researcher who worked on this problem of abiogenesis, named Dean Kenyon. And Kenyon announced on the panel, he also surprised people by sitting on the side with the theists, and explained, he argued that the discovery of the information-bearing properties of DNA, everything that Crick had anticipated, suggests that what he called the natural theological question should now be reopened by the philosophers. In other words, we may as scientists be looking at evidence for the existence of God in the inner workings of the cell. And so I'm, 27 years old. I'm kind of blown away at this. It was clear to me that the theists seemed to have the intellectual initiative in the discussion, that the people defending chemical evolutionary theory had nothing to offer except promissory notes that maybe we'll figure it out down the road. So I got really seized with this. I was working with doing digital signal processing of seismic data, which was an early form of information technology, and the thought that the discovery of information inside cells was the holy grail of the origin of life problem just absolutely seized me. I got really fascinated with that. I met another scientist who was on the panel that day named Charles Thaxton, who had written a recent book called The Mystery of Life's Origin. He happened to be living in Dallas. I started having long conversations with him after work. A year later, I was off to grad school and realized I want to work on this origin of life problem.